my channel, Edible Thoughts Makes. My name is Stephanie and I am coming to you from the middle of March, year 2025. I have a little episode for you today that focuses on the specific topic of sock knitting and needle size and yarn weight. I wanted to share with you a little bit of information from from my sock knitting experience since I started knitting socks in August of 2019. And I wanted just to share a little bit about what I've learned over the years since I started knitting socks. I think I have knit over 100 pairs of socks, and I've gathered some information along the way. I just thought I would take a little bit of time and share that with you today. Just a disclaimer before we get started, I will not be showing you how to knit socks or the best way to knit socks or what you should or should not do. That is not the purpose of this video. If you have been a longtime viewer, you will know that the purpose of my channel is not to tell you what to do or be responsible for any of your projects or modifications. It is rather to share with you what I have learned through my making, and maybe it inspires you to change something up with your making or try something new. So that is the purpose of this episode. And I have jotted down my notes in my notebook here, so I will be definitely looking to it so that I don't get too off track and I remember all the things I want to talk about. And if you are new here, I always include closed captioning in my videos, so you can click on that CC button. If I go faster or slower than your preferences, YouTube also allows you to adjust the speed. If there's anything specific that I talk about that can be linked to, I will link to that in the description box below this video. But in general, I don't plan on talking about specific patterns or specific yarns or brands of needles or anything like that. That's not really the focus of this video, but rather how I decide maybe what needle size to use for a specific type of sock project. Definitely knitting socks is not a one-size-fit-all, pun absolutely intended, but rather maybe it'll give you a little bit of a jumping off point if you are newer to sock knitting, or maybe just some points to consider that you've not tried before. Maybe you've only knit one type of sock because you're nervous about venturing out into a different type of sock. And if I can share a little bit of, some tips and tricks maybe that I have learned along the way, maybe that will just boost your confidence a little bit to give that new pattern a try. While we are chit-chatting here, I am knitting on a pair of socks, so that is what is in my hand. I will show it to you briefly here. This is the Colorwork Cuff Club by Summerlee Designs, knit up in the Farmer's Daughter Fibers Highwood sock base. And this yarn is from the 2025 March Sock Squad sock set. And then the reddish orange is from Little Lionhead Knits. And yeah, so these are the socks that I will be knitting on while we are chatting. I am just on this round and round stockinette portion, so I don't really have to think about it while I am knitting in the round and while I chat with you. The first thing I want to break down is sock yarn weight, needle size, and the approximate gauge. So if you are new to gauge basically looks at your fabric density, how many stitches per inch. The more stitches per inch, the denser the fabric. So the smaller the needle size, the more stitches per inch, the denser the fabric. And for socks in particular, having a denser fabric means that it will be harder to wear a hole into. It'll be hardier. That's the word I'm thinking of, hardier. And generally there will be less pilling. It'll just wear over time a little bit better. So having a denser fabric is generally preferred on socks. The way I usually think about it for myself, now everybody is going to be different. If you knit tighter than I do or looser than I do, then the needle sizes you use will be different. Also keep in mind that needles come in different materials. So some people may prefer wooden or bamboo or stainless steel, or I can't think of the other ones right now, but the different material of your needles can also affect your tension and therefore your gauge. So that is something to think about as well. And for some people, their tension changes if they are using double pointed needles versus small circular needles versus magic loop on longer needles. So that will change as well for some people, but not necessarily for everybody. So that's something to keep in mind. I wasn't planning on talking about the different types of needles that just can change from one person to the next. Like some people might knit tighter on magic loop, but not others. So I wasn't planning on talking about that. But there are lots of different needle types and different materials for needles, and that may be based on preference as to whether you like one method of knitting or another. So first I'm going to start with a category of light fingering weight yarns. So light fingering weight yarns, I personally look at if they are 463 yards per 100 grams. That's kind of I feel like a pretty standard amount, and that's generally seen in the 75-25 superwash wool nylon blends. I feel like in a lot of indie dyed yarns, it's the superwash merino nylon 4-ply sock yarn. It's very smooth, it's a tighter twist, and it's light fingering weight yarn. You may see that classified as sock yarn, but it doesn't have to be just used for socks. And so I try to not call something a sock yarn because it generally just isn't as informative for me, because some people say sock yarn and it has nylon, and or it might not have nylon, but you can also knit socks out of heavier weight yarns. So yeah, so I don't generally prefer the term sock yarn. I will generally refer to it as the weight of the yarn. So like light fingering weight yarn, 4-ply, things like that. So with a light fingering weight yarn, I generally prefer using a US 0 2mm or a US 1 2.25mm needle. And I say or because it just kind of depends on the type of sock that I am knitting, and sometimes it's based on what needles I have available and just what I feel like using. And with the two different needle sizes, I feel like my gauge kind of goes between a 9 to a 9.5 stitches per inch, sometimes even a 10 stitch per inch on a US 0. And that gives a very dense fabric, but it also wears really well over time. It may not stretch as much as knitting with a US 1 or 2.25mm needle just because it's so dense, but I do feel like it wears really well. And if you don't want to knit your entire sock on one needle size, you don't have to either. Recently, I've been playing around with changing up the heel turn. If I'm doing a heel flap and gusset, and doing the heel turn on a US 0, even if the rest of my sock is on a US 1, because that's where I feel like I wear out my socks the most. If I can just make that part denser, then it should just wear better over time in that one specific area. But I only recently did that, so time will tell if that experiment works out. The next weight of yarn is still fingering weight, but I'm looking at like 400 to 437 yards for 100 grams, and I feel like that's pretty common, still with a 75-25 superwash wool nylon blend or an 85-15 superwash merino nylon blend. I think it also is pretty common for 100% wool, and I feel like what other ones have I seen? Oh, an 80-20. I think an 80-20 superwash wool nylon blend I will have seen in the 400 yards for 100 grams as well. And on that, I feel like I generally stick to a US 1 2.25mm needle, and the gauge I get there is like an 8.5 stitches per inch. If I'm really stressed out, sometimes it might be 9 stitches per inch, but I feel like it kind of ranges 8.5 to 9. So with the 437 yards for 100 grams, it might be closer to 9, but the 400 yards, it's closer to 8.5. This is a lot of numbers. Hopefully I'll have it here on the screen to my side so that you can visually see it as well and kind of follow along there. But yes, this little episode is definitely number heavy. Okay, the next weight of yarn I classify as heavy fingering or light sport weight yarn. So that's looking at like anything below 400 yards for 100 grams, but like maybe 325, 350 yards for 100 grams. And that I will use usually a US 1.5 needle, which is a 2.5 millimeter needle. If it's the 400 yards, it'll probably still be the 8 stitches per inch using a US 1 2.25 millimeter needle. But if it's less yardage than that, closer to the sport weight, I really prefer using a US 1.5, which is the 2.5 millimeter needle. I just feel like it's better on my hands, otherwise it can feel way too dense. Then we're getting into sport weight yarn. So like a true sport weight yarn, I feel like is anywhere from 300 to 350 yards for 100 grams. And on that, I usually prefer a US 2 or 2.75 millimeter needle. I just find that most comfortable on my hands. I didn't write down the gauge for that, probably 7 stitches per inch, maybe 7.5 stitches per inch. I meant to write it down, but sorry. And then for a DK weight yarn, I like to use a US 3 or 3.25 millimeter needle, and that can also be a light fingering weight times 2, so held double. Now the way I calculate it is, if it's a light fingering weight yarn, 463 yards divided by 2 is 231 yards. And that's a pretty standard DK weight yarn to be at 230 something yards for 100 grams. So I like to hold fingering weight double, that's light fingering weight double, to achieve a DK weight gauge. If I use a standard like 400 yards for 100 gram fingering weight yarn, that divided by 2 is 200 yards, which to me is then a worsted weight. So if I'm going to knit a worsted weight sock, I can hold fingering weight double and use a US 4 needle, which is a 3.5 millimeter needle. So that's what I prefer. Not everybody prefers that dense of a fabric. So a lot of people will use US 4 for DK weight, US 5 for worsted, or even higher, but that also just depends on your desired density and your tension and your yarn. So to each their own. You'll have to play around with it to see what you like, and instead of knitting up a whole sock, you could just knit a little square and see what you think. But knitting a whole sock will really give you a better feel of the fit and kind of what you're looking for there. Okay, now that I've gone through all those numbers, I have a couple things I want to share that you might want to consider. So if your sock is stockinette versus ribbed, that's going to result in a very different fit. Anything with ribbing, like 1x1, 2x1, 3x1, whatever the ribbing is, it gives you more elasticity and a little more leeway. Uh-oh, I am stuck here. Hold on 1 second. Where was I? So ribbing gives you a little more leeway, which means I really like ribbed socks for gift knitting because you don't have to have the sizing exact. Ribbing allows for a really good fit without having to have the exact measurements that I feel like stockinette can sometimes lean more towards, having to like have exact number of rounds or exact width because there's just less give. And then we have textured socks. So cabled socks, they're gonna cinch in a lot more. Slip stitch socks, so like mosaic knitting or just anything with a slip stitch texture is going to have a lot less elasticity. So on socks like that, you may want to go up in the number of stitches from your usual stitch count just to make sure you have enough room to fit it over your heel when you're putting on your sock. And the last thing to consider is color work. So when you knit color work, you have floats. And if you have floats, that usually means that area is less elastic. Again, you want to be able to fit it over your heel and just be able to wear your socks comfortably. And so sometimes you will go up a needle size for the color work portion, or if the entire sock is color work, you might go up a needle size for the entire sock. Or you can keep with your usual needle size, but increase the number of stitches. So that leads me to the 3 things that you can think about adjusting when knitting socks. So you can adjust the stitch count. Now, if there's a pattern, you will have to adjust it by the repeat of the pattern. So if it's 4-stitch repeat, you might need to go up 4 or down 4, otherwise your repeat won't line up in the round. You can adjust the stitch count, right? I mentioned that. But you don't have to have the stitch count the same for the entire sock. So you could cast on for your cuff of the sock in 1 stitch count and then do an increase round to do the rest of your sock, or just the color work portion of your sock, and then decrease back down before you knit the heel. The other thing you can adjust is your needle size. So if something is too loose, then you can go down a needle size. If something is too tight, you can go up a needle size, but still take into consideration that your fabric density is important for the longevity of your sock. And then the last thing you can change is yarn weight. So if I'm knitting a sock using light fingering weight versus a sock that's knit on like a light sport weight yarn, if I cast them on with the same stitch count, the light fingering weight yarn is still going to come up a lot smaller than my light sport weight yarn because the thickness of the yarn is just different. And so that's something to take into consideration as well. Maybe the Colorwork pattern can't be adjusted very easily. Well, you might be able to adjust it by still following all the same numbers, but change your yarn and change your needles. And that way you get the fit that you want. But of course, it takes a little bit of trial and error and a little bit of playing around. Okay, I think that is all I wanted to share with you on sock knitting and needles and yarn weight. A couple of places that you might want to check out if you haven't already that might help you along your sock knitting journey, I will link to in the description box below this video. One of them is my friend Denise of Earth Tones Girl. She actually was the one that got me started on sock knitting. I had checked out so many books from the library. I had asked some friends about sock knitting, and Denise's approach to learning how to knit socks is so gentle and so welcoming that I was like, okay, I can do this, right? I can try this. And since then, I haven't looked back. And actually, I have looked back. I love all the socks that I have knit, but I have definitely continued my sock knitting adventure, and my entire family wears hand knit socks, I would say 9 months out of the year, because we just don't wear the wool socks in the summer, but we wear them the rest of the year. And it's just been so much fun. And I've definitely found my groove, but I'm still for sure learning. I've tried a lot of different heel types. I have played around with different textures, and I just really enjoy knitting socks. It's also such a small canvas to try something new on. So let's say you want to try cabling, but you don't necessarily want to knit or invest in an entire cabled sweater yet. You can always try it on a sock and see how you feel about it. And maybe you decide you don't like cabling, and it's a good thing you tried it out on a very small canvas before investing in a sweater quantity of yarn and then deciding that was not something you wanted to do. Another great resource is Tin Can Knits. They have lots and lots and lots of sock patterns and garments, but the sock patterns include some free ones as well as paid for ones, and they have a huge range of sizes, usually going from newborn and through several adult sizes. And so that includes the free patterns and the paid for patterns. I mentioned Summer Lee Designs earlier for the sock that I am knitting on. Summer Lee is a sock pattern designer, and she even has a published book on sock patterns. And so I would highly recommend looking into Summer's patterns. I feel like they go the entire range from stockinette to fading to cabled to lace to color work to stripes, the whole thing. She has everything in there, and she has tutorials, and the images in the book are all photographs, which I find much easier to follow than illustrations. And yeah, so I recommend looking into Summer's patterns. Another designer that you might want to look into is Lindsay Fowler of Larkspur Knits. I have knit several of her patterns as well, and they also run the range of textured to color work. I don't remember if there was cable or lace. I'm not generally a cable or lace sock knitter, but I do know there are textured ones and DK weight ones and some color work ones there as well. So again, I will link to those websites in the description box below this video. I hope this video gave you a little bit of insight into sock knitting and hopefully clarified some things for you, or I don't know, if I made everything more messy for you, I sincerely apologize. I did try to jot down my thoughts on paper. Sometimes I am more successful than other times getting my thoughts out in a tangible and cohesive manner. I I think that is everything that I wanted to share with you today. Cheers! Whoops! Cheers to being creative, and I will talk to you next time.